What if I told you that in a single year, a year already mythologized for producing some of rock music's most enduring monuments, a handful of albums were released that were so audacious, so far ahead of their time, that they were met with little more than commercial indifference and critical bewilderment? What if these records, far from being flawed experiments, were in fact fully realized artistic statements, overflowing with a creative fire that still burns with a formidable intensity half a century later? This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the story of 1971, a year in which the titans of progressive rock were consolidating their reign. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a few brave and arguably foolhardy bands were creating masterpieces that would be relegated to the dustbin of history, only to be unearthed decades later by a new generation of sonic archaeologists. These are the stories of 5 such albums, records that are as brilliant as they are obscure, and the reasons why they represent a path not taken in the evolution of rock music. The year 1971 was a pressure cooker of musical innovation. The psychedelic dreams of the late 60s had given way to a more technically ambitious and compositionally complex approach to rock music. The remnants of the counterculture were mingling with a reawakened interest in European classical music, jazz improvisation, and avant-garde compositional techniques. Studios became laboratories where young musicians tested the limits of what was possible with rock and roll instrumentation. Bands like Yes with the Yes album, and Fragile, and Genesis with Nursery Crime were laying the groundwork for what would become the dominant aesthetic of progressive rock. Virtuosic musicianship, epic song structures, and lyrical themes that reached far beyond typical rock and roll concerns. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's Tarkus was a bombastic fusion of rock and classical music that stormed the charts, proving that there was a significant audience for this new, more demanding form of musical expression. Pink Floyd had begun its journey into increasingly atmospheric and experimental realms with metal, while Jethro Tull proved with Aqualung that prog rock could also be commercially extremely successful. The British music scene was simmering with creativity. In London, Canterbury, Birmingham, and even in the sleepiest provincial towns, young bands were rehearsing in damp basements, dreaming of changing the world with their vision. The record companies, enticed by the success of bands like King Crimson and the Moody Blues, were willing to take risks and give unknown acts a chance. It was a brief golden era before the bureaucratization and commercialization of the industry would make such gambles impossible. But for all the talk of pushing boundaries, a formula was already beginning to emerge, a set of conventions that, while expansive, still operated within a recognizable framework. The bands that would achieve massive success in the coming years did so by tempering their experimentation with a degree of palatability. Their music was complex, but it was also, for the most part, clean, polished, and ultimately safe. There were rules, unspoken boundaries of good taste and musical coherence that were not to be crossed. But what about the bands that refused to play it safe? What about the artists who ventured so far into the wilderness that they lost sight of the path back to commercial viability? What happened to those who placed their artistic vision above any prospect of success? This is where our story begins. In the murky, often merciless underbelly of the British music scene, where the line between genius and madness was often dangerously thin, where poverty and obsession went hand in hand, and where the flame of true artistic integrity burned brightest, before being extinguished by the icy winds of commercial disinterest. Our first exhibit is an album that is less a collection of songs than a sonic exorcism, a musical summoning of dark forces that were better left undisturbed. Gomez's first utterance. To call this album disturbing would be a gross understatement, a trivialization that fails to do justice to the sheer intensity of this recording. From the opening moments of Diana, with its frenetic acoustic guitars and Roger Wooten's wild, almost unhinged vocal performance, it is clear that we are in uncharted territory, a realm where the usual rules of music production no longer apply. This is not the pastoral gentlefolk of Fairport Convention or Pentangle. This is something far more primal, a descent into a pre-Christian world of pagan rituals, violence, and madness. The band, named after the Roman god of revelry and excess, lived up to its name by creating music that was both intoxicating and repulsive. The instrumentation is almost entirely acoustic: guitars, violin, flute, double bass, and percussion, yet it possesses a ferocity that would put most heavy metal bands to shame. It is as if a medieval execution has been set to music. The interplay between Colin Pearson's jagged, almost violent violin and the intricate, often dissonant guitar work of Wooten and Glenn Goring creates a feeling of constant tension, the sense that the music is perpetually on the verge of collapsing into chaos. The arrangements are complex and multi-layered, but there is no soothing beauty, no melodic redemption. Instead, there is only a relentless intensity that never lets the listener go. The rhythmic structures are unpredictable, shifting between acoustic waltzes and almost military march drum rhythms. The oboe of Lindsay Cooper adds another degree of strangeness, its sound reminiscent of ancient folk music, but twisted into something sinister. The lyrical themes of First Utterance are as shocking today as they were in 1971. Songs like Drip Drip and Song to Comus deal with themes of rape and murder with a terrifying directness that is still hard to process. Drip Drip is told from the perspective of a rapist with a level of detail that would make even hardened horror fans shudder. Song to Comus describes an orgiastic blood feast in the wilderness. This was not metaphorical darkness, not a safe role-play with gothic imagery. This felt real, dangerous, as if the music itself could harm the listener. Yet there is a strange, almost terrifying beauty to be found in the madness. The vocal harmonies of Wooten and Bobby Watson are often breathtakingly beautiful, creating a stark contrast to the ugliness of the subject matter. Watson's clear, almost angelic voice provides a shattering counter-melody to Wooten's hoarse growl. This contrast makes the music even more unsettling. The beauty of the performance highlights the monstrosity of the content, rather than obscuring it. This is music that refuses to look away from the darkness, that confronts the most savage aspects of human nature with an unflinching gaze. The production aesthetic of First Utterance is just as remarkable. Recorded at Chappell Studios in London, the album has a rawness that was unusual even for 1971. There are no overdubs to smooth out rough edges, no effects to create a polished surface. You hear every breath, every squeak of fingers on guitar strings, every imperfect moment. This immediacy gives the music its power. It is as if the band is sitting right in the room with you, playing these frightening songs just for you. Unsurprisingly, First Utterance was a commercial disaster. The album was met with a mixture of confusion and outright hostility from the music press. Critics did not know how to classify it. Was it folk? Progressive rock? Proto-metal? The truth was that it defied any easy categorization. The band itself was a volatile unit, torn apart by internal tensions and artistic differences, and they would break up shortly after the album's release. Wooten and Watson had a turbulent personal and professional relationship that ended in violence and mutual recriminations. For decades, First Utterance was little more than a footnote in the history of progressive rock, a whispered legend among a small circle of dedicated fans who traded original pressings for astronomical sums. But its influence was profound, albeit subterranean. David Bowie was an early champion of the band, praising their uncompromising vision. Their DNA can be found in the work of countless artists who have sought to explore the darker, more primal side of folk music. Mikael Åkerfeldt of the Swedish metal band Opeth has cited the album as a major influence, drawing a connection between Comus' acoustic horror and Opeth's own blend of death metal and progressive folk. In the last 2 decades, First Utterance has experienced a renaissance. Reissues on vinyl have been snapped up by collectors, and the band has even reunited for occasional concerts, playing to reverent audiences who were too young to have been alive in 1971. First Utterance is a testament to the power of music to disturb, to provoke, and to haunt the listener long after the final notes have faded. It is an album that proves that true art can and should be dangerous. From the pagan darkness of Comus, we move to the lush symphonic landscapes of our second lost classic, Spring's self-titled debut. If First Utterance is a journey into the heart of darkness, then Spring is a journey into a world of melancholy beauty, a meditation on loss, memory, and the transience of all things. The dominant instrument on this album is the mellotron, a primitive tape-based keyboard capable of producing a hauntingly beautiful, though notoriously unreliable, string sound. The mellotron was the secret weapon of early 70s progressive rock. Each key activated a length of magnetic tape on which real orchestral instruments were recorded. The result was a sound that was both organic and strange, real instruments, but mediated through technology. The tapes were prone to stretching and damage, which meant that each mellotron had its own quirks and sonic characteristics. While many progressive rock bands of the era used the mellotron to add a touch of orchestral grandeur to their music, Spring made it the very foundation of their sound, the architectural framework on which everything else rested. The result is an album that floats in a sea of strings, creating a sound that is both epic and deeply intimate. The mellotron strings form dense, shifting textures that lay over the landscape of the songs like banks of fog. There are moments when the mellotron carries the musical narrative almost single-handedly, with only sparse accompaniment from guitar and bass. This decision to give the instrument so much space was bold and unconventional, especially in an era where technical virtuosity and complex arrangements were the standard. The songs on Spring are built around the smoky, often wistful vocals of Pat Moran and the tasteful melodic guitar work of Ray Martinez. Moran's voice has a fragile quality, almost as if whispered, that perfectly suits the album's melancholic atmosphere. She does not sing with the power of a rock star, but with the intimacy of a friend whispering secrets in the dark. Martinez's guitar adds moments of clarity and light. His lines are clean and melodic, never intrusive, always in service of the song. The lyrics are pensive and often imbued with a sense of loss and longing, as evidenced by song titles like Shipwrecked Soldier and Song to Absent Friends. Shipwrecked Soldier tells the story of a man lost at sea, clinging to memories of home as he slowly drifts towards death. Grail Seeker is an allegorical search for meaning in a meaningless world. These are not superficial pop songs about teenage romance, but mature reflections on the human condition. Yet for all their melancholy, there is a warmth and a humanity to this music that is often lacking in the more bombastic and technically focused work of their contemporaries. Spring's rhythm section, bassist Adrian Maloney and drummer Pick Withers, provides a solid but unobtrusive foundation. Withers, who would later find fame as the original drummer for Dire Straits, already shows his talent for restrained, tasteful accompaniment here. His work on Spring is a masterpiece of restraint, knowing exactly when to step back and give space to the mellotron and vocals. This is music that is not afraid to be beautiful, to wear its heart on its sleeve, to show vulnerability as a strength. Like Comus, Spring was a band that seemed to exist outside the prevailing trends of the time. They were not as technically flashy as Yes or ELP, nor did they possess the theatrical flair of Genesis. Their music was more subtle, more restrained, and it required a degree of patience and attention that may have been in short supply in the fast-paced world of early 70s rock. In an era that celebrated virtuosity and spectacle, Spring offered contemplation and stillness. In a time that was pushing forward, Spring looked back with nostalgia and regret. The album failed to make a commercial impact, and the band broke up shortly after its release. The members scattered to other projects, some leaving the music industry altogether. Pat Moran disappeared from public life, and for years, no one knew what had become of her. This air of mystery added an extra layer of mystique to the album. For years, Spring was a coveted collector's item, a lost artifact of the progressive rock era, trading for hundreds of pounds at flea markets and in record stores. Today, it stands as a testament to the power of melody and atmosphere, a reminder that progressive rock could be as much about feeling as it was about technical skill. It is an album that proves that beauty and melancholy can be just as radical as noise and aggression. In a time that celebrated size and bombast, Spring dared to be small, intimate, and profoundly human. Our third exhibit, Gracious, This Is Gracious, is a more aggressive and overtly progressive affair than the previous two albums. This is a band that was clearly influenced by King Crimson, with its complex time signatures, abrupt dynamic shifts, and a penchant for extended instrumental workouts. If Comus explored the dark side of British folklore and Spring reveled in melancholy, Gracious plunged headfirst into the future of rock, armed with Marshall amps and a dizzying self-confidence. The centerpiece of the album is the 25-minute Supernova, a sprawling epic that moves through a variety of moods and styles, from heavy, riff-based rock to more delicate, classically influenced passages. Supernova is divided into several sections, each with its own identity, yet all linked by recurring thematic motifs. The composition shows a deep understanding of both rock dynamics and classical structural principles. There are moments of shattering intensity, with the band playing at full force, and moments of almost chamber music delicacy. The musicianship is first-rate, with guitarist Alan Cowderoy and keyboardist Martin Kitcat engaging in a series of thrilling instrumental duels. Cowderoy was an exceptionally talented guitarist, capable of delivering both powerful riffs and complex melodic lines. His playing shows influences of Robert Fripp, but also of jazz guitarists like John McLaughlin. Kitcat, who switches between Hammond organ and piano, provides both the harmonic foundation and explosive solos that vie with Cowderoy's guitar for supremacy. What sets Gracious apart from many of their contemporaries is their willingness to embrace a certain amount of raw, almost garage rock energy. There is a hardness and a sense of urgency in their playing that is often missing from the more polished productions of the era. The recording quality itself is a bit rough around the edges, which gives the music an extra layer of immediacy. This is a band that sounds like they are playing for their lives, and that energy is infectious. You can almost see the beads of sweat, hear the strain in every note. Vocalist Tim Wheatley delivers a powerful, if occasionally overwrought, performance. His voice is reminiscent of Greg Lake of ELP, with a theatrical quality that perfectly suits the epic scope of the music. In the quieter passages, he shows a surprising tenderness, but in the heavier sections, he unleashes an intensity that recalls the early days of Robert Plant. The rhythm section, Tim Mycroft on bass and Robert Lipson on drums, provides a powerful foundation, with Lipson particularly shining in the more complex metric passages. The album is not without its flaws. The vocals can sometimes be a bit over the top, and some of the more experimental passages can feel a bit unfocused. There are moments when the band seems to be trying to do too much at once, where the composition threatens to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Yet there is a sense of daring and a commitment to pushing the boundaries of rock music that is impossible to deny. Gracious were pioneers, venturing into uncharted territory, and like all pioneers, they occasionally made mistakes. But these mistakes are part of the album's charm, evidence of its human, imperfect nature. The story of Gracious is a familiar one in the annals of progressive rock. They were a band with an abundance of talent and ambition, but they could not secure the support of a record label that truly understood their vision. This is Gracious was released on the Philips label, a subsidiary of the larger Vertigo Records, but it received little advertising or promotion. The band had already broken up by the time the album was released, torn apart by the usual internal tensions and financial difficulties. The individual members scattered to other projects, some remaining in the music industry, others not. Today, it stands as a powerful example of the more aggressive and experimental side of early British progressive rock. It is an album that shows that prog did not have to be all about symphonic grandeur and technical precision, but could also include rawness, urgency, and raw emotional power. Gracious never received the recognition they deserved, but their influence can be felt in the work of later bands who sought to fuse the intensity of heavy rock with the complexity of progressive. Our fourth lost masterpiece comes from a duo of musicians who had already tasted success as members of one of the most important bands in the history of progressive rock. MacDonald and Giles's self-titled album is a fascinating what-if scenario in the history of King Crimson, a fork in the road that could have led to a completely different version of what progressive rock would become. Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles were both founding members of King Crimson, and their contributions to their legendary debut album, in the court of the Crimson King were immense. MacDonald's versatile instrumentation, he played saxophone, flute, vibraphone, keyboards, and mellotron, gave the album much of its orchestral texture. Giles's drumming was both powerful and nuanced, capable of shifting from jazz-like polyrhythms to straight-ahead rock. However, both grew weary of the stresses of touring and the darker, more intense direction the band was taking under Robert Fripp's vision, and they left the band in late 1969, just months after the release of their triumphant debut. The following year, they reunited to record this one-off album, and the results are a revelation, a glimpse into an alternate reality of progressive rock. MacDonald and Giles is a much lighter and more melodic affair than anything King Crimson would ever record. The album is filled with beautiful pastoral melodies, lush vocal harmonies, and a sense of warmth and optimism that stands in stark contrast to the often bleak soundscapes of their former band. Where Crimson was dark, intense, and often menacing, MacDonald and Giles is bright, playful, and deeply human. The musicianship is, of course, impeccable. Giles's drumming is as inventive and dynamic as ever, with a particular brilliance in his ability to make unusual rhythms sound organic. MacDonald's multi-instrumental talents are on full display, as he switches between saxophone, flute, keyboards, and guitar, often layering multiple instruments in a single song. The vocal work, primarily handled by MacDonald, is warm and inviting, a welcome change from Greg Lake's more theatrical approach in Crimson. The centerpiece of the album is the side-long Birdman, a whimsical and charming piece of music that showcases the duo's compositional and arranging skills. Birdman tells the fanciful story of a man who believes he can fly, and ultimately throws himself off a cliff. Despite the dark subject matter, the music is light and airy, with fluttering flute motifs and ornate piano passages, reminiscent of Erik Satie. The piece moves through several sections, each representing a different stage of the Birdman's story, and culminates in a devastating but beautiful climax. The album is not without its more experimental moments, but even these are imbued with a sense of playfulness and a melodic sensibility that makes them accessible and engaging. Flight of the Ibis is an instrumental showcase that highlights MacDonald's saxophone skills, while Is She Waiting is a tender love song that shows MacDonald's softer songwriting side. The production, handled by MacDonald himself, is warm and organic, with a focus on clarity and natural instrument sounds rather than studio trickery. MacDonald and Giles is the sound of two brilliant musicians freed from the constraints of a band and a genre they had helped to create, and the result is a joyful and life-affirming album. It is music that celebrates beauty without irony, that believes in the power of melody, regardless of fashionable trends. In a time that was increasingly celebrating darkness and complexity for their own sake, MacDonald and Giles dared to be simple and directly beautiful. But once again, commercial success proved elusive. The album was met with a lukewarm response from both critics and audiences, who dismissed it as too light, too unambitious compared to the more heavyweight work of their peers. Sales were disappointing, and MacDonald and Giles went their separate ways shortly after its release. Giles would continue to work sporadically in the music industry, while MacDonald moved to the United States and eventually co-founded Foreigner, one of the most successful arena rock bands of the late 70s and 80s. An ironic twist for someone who had once been at the cutting edge of art rock. Our final exhibit is perhaps the most unique and unclassifiable album on our list. Fuchsia's self-titled debut. This is a band that truly defies categorization, a musical chameleon that drew on elements from so many different sources that the end result was something entirely new. At its core, Fuchsia was a folk rock band, but their music was augmented by a string section of 2 violins and a cello. The result is a sound that is both earthy and ethereal, a strange and beautiful blend of folk, classical and psychedelic rock that sounds as if it came from a parallel world where the troubadours of the Middle Ages had access to electric amplifiers. The songs, written by guitarist and vocalist Tony Durant, are full of whimsical and often surreal imagery, and they are delivered with a sense of wide-eyed innocence that is absolutely enchanting. Durant's lyrics read like fairy tales for adults, filled with talking animals, enchanted forests, and mysterious travelers. The Nothing song is about emptiness and meaninglessness, but in a playful, almost childlike way. Shoes and Ships is an absurd cataloging of everyday objects, transformed into something magical by the musical treatment. There is a Lewis Carroll-like quality to Durant's writing, a willingness to follow nonsense wherever it may lead. The arrangements on Fuchsia are incredibly inventive, showing a deep understanding of both traditional folk music and classical composition techniques. The strings are not simply used as a backdrop for the songs, as a decorative addition. They are an integral part of the music, weaving intricate counter-melodies and engaging in a constant dialogue with the more traditional rock instrumentation. Violinist Vanessa Hall-Smith and cellist Madeline Bland bring a classically trained precision to the band, but they are also willing to experiment, to use their instruments in unconventional ways. There are moments when the cello is played pizzicato like a bass, moments when the violins screech and howl like rock guitars. The album is full of unexpected twists and turns, with songs that shift mood and tempo on a dime. Gone with the Mouse begins as a delicate acoustic piece, then transforms into a hard-rocking middle section, before returning to its original delicacy. This structural fluidity was characteristic of progressive rock, but Fuchsia brought a lightness of touch and a sense of humor that was missing from many of their more serious-minded peers. The band did not take themselves too seriously, and that playfulness is one of the album's most charming aspects. Michael Day, the band's other main songwriter and vocalist, brings a different sensibility to the table. Where Durant is childlike and whimsical, Day is more introspective and melancholic. His Another Nail is a somber meditation on mortality, while the Nothing song, to which both contributed, is a philosophical inquiry into existence. This duality between Durant and Day gives the album a rich emotional palette, preventing it from becoming too one-dimensional. The rhythm section, bassist Michael Gregory and drummer Pete Stacey, provides a solid, if unobtrusive, foundation. Stacey's drumming is particularly notable for its restraint. In an era when drummers were often showcasing their technical prowess, Stacey understood when to step back and give space to the strings and vocals. Gregory's bass is melodic and nimble, often locking in with the cello to create a unique low-end depth. The story of Fuchsia is one of youthful ambition and naivety, but also of the harsh realities of the music industry. The band was formed in 1970 by a group of university students at Exeter University, united by a shared love of music and a desire to create something new and different. They were not seasoned musicians who had spent years honing their craft on the club circuit, but students with big ideas and limited practical experience. This inexperience gave their music both a freshness and an occasional raggedness. They managed to secure a record deal with the Pegasus label, a small independent label known for its willingness to take risks on unconventional acts. They recorded their debut album with producer David Hitchcock, who had also worked with Caravan and Genesis, and had a good feel for the needs of progressive bands. Hitchcock helped them to bring their vision to life without smoothing over its raw immediacy. However, the band was ill-prepared for the realities of the music business. They were academic idealists, in an industry governed by harsh commercial realities. They were poorly managed and received little support from their record label, which had neither the resources nor the expertise to properly market such an unconventional album. The album sank without a trace, selling only a few hundred copies in its initial release. The band tried to carry on, even recording a second album, but the discouragement of their debut's failure was too much. They broke up in 1973, and the members returned to more conventional lives. For decades, Fuchsia was a lost classic, a record known only to a small handful of dedicated collectors who treated original pressings like holy relics. In recent years, however, the album has been rediscovered and reissued, and it has finally begun to receive the recognition it so richly deserves. Modern listeners, freed from the constraints of genre conventions, can appreciate the unique beauty of what Fuchsia achieved. An album that blends folk, rock, classical, and pure fantasy into something truly special. So why did these 5 brilliant albums fail to find an audience in 1971? The reasons are as complex and varied as the music itself, and they reveal a great deal about the workings of the music industry at the time. In some cases, it was simply a matter of bad luck and poor management. Bands like Fuchsia and Spring suffered from inadequate promotion, small labels with no distribution power, and a lack of professional management that could have helped them navigate the complexities of the industry. In other cases, it was a case of the music being too challenging, too unconventional for the mainstream tastes of the time. The early 1970s was a period of great musical experimentation, but it was also a time when the music industry was becoming increasingly corporate and risk-averse. The major labels were consolidating their power, and the decisions about what got recorded and promoted were increasingly being made by marketing departments, not by A&R men with musical instincts. The bands that succeeded were the ones that could find a balance between artistic ambition and commercial appeal. They were technically impressive enough to command respect, but melodic enough to get radio play. The bands we have discussed today were, for the most part, unwilling or unable to make that compromise. Comus refused to soften their disturbing lyrical themes or tone down their musical intensity. Spring created music that was too subtle, too contemplative for an audience that was coming to expect spectacle. Gracious broke up before they had a chance to build a wider following. MacDonald and Giles failed to step out of the massive shadow of King Crimson. Fuchsia was too whimsical, too unclassifiable for an audience that wanted clear genre definitions. There were also technological and economic factors at play. In 1971, radio was still the primary means by which people discovered new music, and radio programmers were notoriously conservative in their choices. A 25-minute epic like Gracious Supernova stood no chance of getting airplay. The complex arrangements and unusual instrumentation made these albums expensive to produce, but difficult to market. And in a time before the internet, there was no way for niche audiences to find these obscure releases. Yet in their failure, these bands achieved a different kind of success, a success that is perhaps more valuable and enduring than commercial chart placements. They created music that was pure and uncompromising, music that was made for no other reason than the joy of creation itself, the need to make their visions a reality, regardless of the consequences. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy of recordings that continue to inspire and challenge listeners half a century later. These albums have grown in stature with age. What seemed like commercial failures in 1971 are now seen as artistic triumphs. The very qualities that made them unmarketable at the time, their uncompromising nature, their willingness to take risks, their refusal to conform to expectations, are precisely what make them so valuable today. In an era of increasing homogenization in popular music, these albums offer a refreshing reminder that it was once possible to make music that was truly original, music that followed no trends, but created its own paths. The story of these albums is also a story of rediscovery and rehabilitation. In the 1980s and 90s, dedicated fans and historians began to unearth these forgotten masterpieces. Small independent labels like Repertoire and Esoteric began to issue re-releases, often with bonus material and extensive liner notes that provided context and history. The internet allowed fans from all over the world to connect, to share information, and to celebrate these obscure recordings. Suddenly, albums that had been virtually impossible to find for decades were just a click away. This rediscovery had a real-world impact on the artists involved. Some, like the members of Comus, experienced late-career renaissances, touring festivals and playing to adoring audiences. Others, who had long since left music behind, were surprised and delighted to discover that their forgotten works had found a new generation of fans. There was a justice in it, a belated recognition that while it could not undo the original failure, at least proved that their work had not been in vain. These are not just lost albums. They are secret histories, alternate timelines in the story of rock music. They represent paths not taken, possibilities not fully realized. They are a reminder that the most interesting and rewarding music is often found not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, created by artists who were less interested in fame than in bringing their visions to life. And they pose a question that is just as relevant today as it was in 1971. Have we forgotten how to listen? In an age of instant gratification and disposable pop music, where algorithms curate our musical diets and songs are consumed in second-long clips on social media, these albums demand our attention, our patience, and our willingness to be challenged. They demand that we sit down, turn off the distractions, and truly listen. They do not reward passive attention or superficial engagement. They are not easy listening experiences, but they are essential ones. They remind us that music can be more than background noise or a commercial commodity. It can be art in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word. It can challenge us, disturb us, move us, and transform us. It can explore territories we did not know existed and express emotions for which we have no words. For those who are willing to take the journey, the rewards are immeasurable. These 5 albums, Comus's First Utterance, Spring's Spring, Gracious, This Is Gracious, MacDonald and Giles, and Fuchsia's Fuchsia, represent an alternative history of progressive rock, one in which uncompromising art triumphed over commerce, in which artistic vision mattered more than sales figures, in which musicians dared to be truly different. They are monuments to the courage to take risks, to the willingness to fail rather than compromise one's vision. They are evidence that failure in the commercial sense is often artistic success in the deepest sense. And they are a challenge to us as listeners. Are we brave enough to follow them into the unknown territories they explored? Do we have the patience and the open-mindedness to appreciate music that defies our expectations and shatters our comfort zones? The story of progressive rock is usually told through the lens of its commercial giants. Yes, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Emerson Lake, and Palmer. And those are undoubtedly important bands who made great music. But the true story, the complete story, must also include these forgotten pioneers, these bands who never got the fame they deserved, but whose contributions to the richness and diversity of the era's music were just as significant. 1971 was a year of possibilities, a moment when it seemed as if rock music could go anywhere, become anything. These 5 albums represent some of the most fascinating and rewarding of those unrealized possibilities. They are windows into alternate realities, letters from parallel universes, and they are still waiting to be heard by anyone who is brave enough to listen.